Before skyscrapers, before borders, before the word Canada even existed, this land was a vast expanse of ice, forests, and endless silence. The story of Canada begins long before any map, before any empire, and before the idea of nation itself. This is not only the story of a country, it is the story of survival, struggle, and the human spirit across tens of thousands of years. Thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, most of modern Canada was buried under sheets of ice. When the ice began to melt, rivers carved valleys and lakes filled the land. The Great Lakes, the prairies, the tundra, all were shaped by that ancient ice. As the glaciers retreated, life followed. Caribou, mammoths, and early humans moved into this land. Archaeological evidence shows that humans arrived in North America over 12,000 years ago, crossing from Siberia through the Bering Land Bridge. They did not discover the land. They became part of it. They learned its rhythms, its dangers, and its seasons. Long before Europeans, hundreds of nations lived across the land. The Haida built cedar canoes that cut through the Pacific waves. The Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, built longhouses and formed political alliances that lasted centuries. The Cree and Inuit thrived in the Arctic, surviving where most humans could not. Each nation had its own language, beliefs, and systems of law. Trade routes connected communities from the Atlantic to the Rockies. Copper from Lake Superior reached faraway tribes. Shells from the coast were traded deep inland. For thousands of years, this land was not empty wilderness. It was home. It had laws, economies, and culture long before the first European arrived. In the late 10th century, Norse explorers from Greenland briefly reached the shores of Newfoundland. They built a small settlement at Lonceau Meadows, but their contact with the local people was short and tense, and they left. 5 centuries later, in 1497, the Italian explorer John Cabot, sailing under the English flag, reached the same coast. He saw endless codfish, enough to feed Europe. Soon, European fishing ships began visiting the Atlantic waters every summer. By the early 1500s, the French entered the story. Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River, meeting the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. He claimed the land for France, calling it Canada, from the word Kanata, meaning village. The first real relationship between Europeans and indigenous nations was built on trade, especially fur. Beaver pelts became more valuable than gold in Europe. The French relied on indigenous knowledge for survival, transport, and hunting. In return, they traded metal tools, blankets, and weapons. But trade also brought disease. Smallpox and influenza wiped out entire communities. Still, alliances formed. The French allied with the Huron and Algonquin, while the English sided with the Iroquois. The seeds of empire and conflict were planted early. The balance between cultures began to shift, and the story of Canada was forever changed. This was the beginning, when nations met, traded, fought, and adapted. The next chapter would bring empires, wars, and revolutions. New France would rise from the St. Lawrence River, and Canada's modern identity would slowly start to take shape. But before there was Canada, there was a meeting of worlds, and the echoes of that meeting still shape the country today. When the French came to the land they called New France, they didn't only bring ships and flags, they brought ambition. They dreamed of an empire stretching from the cold Atlantic to the heart of the continent. But this dream came with struggle. Between the rivers and forests of this new world, France and England would fight for control, not only of land, but of the future itself. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded a settlement at Quebec City. He saw it as the key to France's colonial power. The cliffs of Quebec overlooked the St. Lawrence River, a gateway to the interior of North America. The French focused on trade, not conquest. Fur was their gold. Traders and missionaries traveled deep inland, guided by indigenous allies. They built small forts and missions instead of large cities. The French population grew slowly. Most settlers were men, soldiers, traders, and priests. The king sent les filles du roi, the king's daughters, to help build families in New France. By the late 1600s, a few thousand French colonists lived in the St. Lawrence Valley. They spoke their own French, farmed the land, and developed a strong identity separate from France. The Jesuit missionaries played a key role in early New France. They tried to convert indigenous nations to Christianity. They learned local languages and lived among them. Some indigenous communities welcomed their knowledge and trade goods. Others resisted conversion and control. This period became a middle ground, a place where two worlds met, exchanged, and adapted. Marriages between French men and indigenous women created families that blended both traditions. These families became known as the Métis, one of Canada's founding peoples. But under the surface, tension grew. European diseases and rivalries began to reshape entire regions. Old alliances shifted. The French and English expanded their reach, each claiming more land than they could hold. The fur trade was the heart of the French economy. Every pelt traded in Montreal or Quebec City traveled thousands of kilometers from the Great Lakes or the prairies. Voyageurs and coureurs des bois, French traders, became legends. They braved rivers, forests, and winter to reach remote communities. The French worked closely with indigenous nations, unlike the English, who built separate settlements. But the competition for furs brought war. The Iroquois Confederacy, allied with the English, attacked French trading posts and their allies. The Huron and Algonquin suffered heavy losses. Entire villages vanished under the pressure of war and disease. The French crown responded by strengthening military control. Quebec became the administrative center of a growing colonial empire. By 1700, France's claim stretched from Newfoundland to Louisiana. England had its own colonies to the south, the 13 colonies. They were richer, larger, and growing fast. Conflict between the two empires was inevitable. In 1754, war broke out again in North America. The French and Indian War, part of the global 7 Years' War, would decide the fate of the continent. French forces and indigenous allies won early victories. They used ambushes and guerrilla tactics, striking from the forests. But the British had more men, more ships, and more money. They slowly surrounded New France. By 1759, the final battle was near. On September 13, 1759, British and French troops faced each other outside Quebec City. The British, led by General James Wolfe, climbed the cliffs under cover of night. The French, commanded by the Marquis de Montcalm, rushed to meet them. The battle lasted less than an hour. Both generals were killed. When the smoke cleared, the British flag flew over Quebec. A year later, Montreal surrendered. New France had fallen. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. France gave up almost all its North American territories to Britain. The French settlers became British subjects overnight. They spoke a different language, followed a different religion, and faced an uncertain future. After the conquest, British officials struggled to rule a mostly French population. There were about 70,000 French Canadians in Quebec. They farmed their land, followed Catholic traditions, and resisted British control. The British tried to impose their laws and language, but it failed. To keep peace, the Crown passed the Quebec Act of 1774. It allowed the French to keep their language, religion, and civil law. This decision shaped Canada's identity forever. It created a country where two cultures lived side by side, not always in harmony, but together. When the American Revolution began in 1775, Britain faced rebellion to the south. Many Americans who stayed loyal to the king fled north to Canada. These loyalists brought English culture, language, and new ideas. They settled in Nova Scotia, Ontario, and New Brunswick. Their arrival divided the country, French in the east, English in the west. The foundation of modern Canada was forming. The story of New France ended, but the story of Canada was only beginning. Out of empire and war came a fragile balance, and between English and French, old and new. The next chapter would test this balance as Canada moved towards self-rule and nationhood. By the end of the 18th century, Canada was no longer a French colony. It was a land divided between British control and French heritage. New settlers arrived. Old traditions held strong. But as the world changed, so did Canada. What began as scattered colonies would soon become a united country. After the American Revolution, thousands of English-speaking loyalists moved north. They brought new customs, languages, and beliefs. To manage these differences, Britain divided its northern territory in 1791. Upper Canada became English-speaking. Lower Canada remained French-speaking. This division worked for a time, but conflict grew fast. The French majority in Lower Canada felt ignored by British rulers. The English settlers in Upper Canada wanted more independence. By the 1830s, tension turned into open revolt. In 1837, both Upper and Lower Canada saw uprisings. They failed, but their message was clear. People wanted a voice in their own government. The British government sent Lord Durham to investigate. His 1839 report became famous. He said, "Two nations warring within the bosom of a single state." He proposed uniting the two Canadas into one. In 1841, the Act of Union merged them into the province of Canada. But even united, the divide between English and French remained strong. Governments changed often. Corruption grew. The colony was unstable. At the same time, other regions like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick demanded their own say. The idea of a larger united country started to grow. A federation that could stand on its own. In 1864, three Canadian leaders, John A. Macdonald, Georges-Étienne Cartier, and George Brown, formed an alliance called the Great Coalition, their goal to solve the political deadlock and build a stronger nation. They met with leaders from other British colonies in what is now Prince Edward Island. This meeting, called the Charlottetown Conference, changed history. At first, the plan was to create a union of maritime colonies. But the Canadians arrived with a bigger vision, a united confederation across the north. Delegates from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the province of Canada agreed to join forces. They discussed rights, language, religion, and representation. They built a plan for something new, the Dominion of Canada. On July 1st, 1867, the British North America Act took effect. Canada was born. At first, it had 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. John A. Macdonald became the first prime minister. The country still recognized the British monarch, but now had its own parliament and laws. The new flag was not yet the maple leaf. The capital was Ottawa. The dream was unity. The challenge was survival. The next goal was to expand west. British Columbia, Manitoba, and the vast Northwest Territories joined in the years that followed. The government promised land, jobs, and a railway to connect the country from sea to sea. But expansion came at a cost. The government signed treaties with Indigenous nations, promising respect and partnership. Many of those promises were broken. Land was taken. Cultures were attacked. Residential schools would later destroy generations. At the same time, immigrants arrived from Europe, seeking opportunity. The railway brought movement, but also conflict, between settlers, workers, and the people who had been there for thousands of years. The late 1800s were a time of progress and struggle. Cities like Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg grew quickly. New industries appeared: lumber, mining, and manufacturing. Canada became a land of workers and farmers, of hope and hardship. French Canadians fought to preserve their language and culture. English Canadians looked to Britain for leadership. And the First Nations peoples faced pressure to give up their ways of life. Despite tension, the dream of unity continued. Canada was learning what it meant to be a country. Not British, not French, but something new. By 1900, Canada was changing fast. Population was rising. Immigrants from Europe and Asia brought new languages, foods, and traditions. Cities expanded. The railway linked oceans. But questions remained. Who truly belonged to this new nation? Whose history mattered most? And how would Canada balance its two founding cultures with hundreds of new ones? These questions still echo today. Canada was young, powerful, diverse, and uncertain. A country built by many hands, still searching for its place in the world. By the dawn of the 20th century, Canada had become a land of contrasts, a young country with old roots, a growing power yet still tied to Britain, a place of freedom for some and struggle for others. The next century would test what Canada stood for, and who it wanted to be. In 1914, when Britain declared war on Germany, Canada followed automatically. Over 600,000 Canadians joined the fight. Many had never left their hometowns before. They fought in the muddy trenches of Europe, Ypres, the Somme, and Vimy Ridge. Vimy became a turning point. For the first time, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together. They won, but at a huge cost. 10,000 dead or wounded. That battle changed how the world saw Canada. No longer a small colony, it was a nation that could stand on its own. But back home, divisions grew. French Canadians, led by Henri Bourassa, opposed conscription. They saw it as Britain's war, not theirs. The split between English and French deepened once again. After the war, Canada tried to rebuild. The 1920s brought jazz, cars, and electricity. Women won the right to vote in most provinces. Cities grew and the economy flourished. But in 1929, the stock market crashed. Factories closed. Farmers lost their land. The Great Depression hit Canada hard. People lined up for food. Men searched for work that didn't exist. The government struggled to respond. Out of the crisis came new movements. The fight for workers' rights, social welfare, and fairness. The pain of the Depression reshaped Canadian politics forever. In 1939, the world went to war again. This time, Canada declared war on its own, a clear sign of independence. Over 1 million Canadians served. They fought in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. Women entered the workforce in record numbers. Factories produced planes, ships, and weapons for the Allies. The war brought unity, but also scars. Japanese Canadians were forced into internment camps. Indigenous soldiers fought bravely abroad, only to return to discrimination at home. When the war ended, Canada emerged stronger, richer, and more respected. It was no longer Britain's shadow. It was a voice in the world. The 1950s and 60s were years of optimism. Highways spread across the land. Suburbs rose outside cities. Television connected people like never before. Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson introduced peacekeeping missions that gave Canada a reputation for diplomacy. He also gave the country its own national flag in 1965, the red and white maple leaf. But beneath the pride, tension brewed in Quebec. Many French Canadians felt excluded from power and opportunity. They called for change, not violence, but recognition. The Quiet Revolution transformed Quebec's schools, government, and culture. It became a modern, secular society, confident and proud. The 1970s brought new challenges. The FLQ crisis and kidnappings in Quebec shocked the nation. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau faced the hardest decision of his career: to invoke the War Measures Act, suspending civil rights to restore order. At the same time, Canada faced questions about who it truly was. Immigration was changing its face. People arrived from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The country was becoming multicultural, but unity was fragile. Trudeau pushed for a new vision, a charter of rights and freedoms. In 1982, the Constitution was brought home from Britain. Canada was finally fully independent. The late 20th century brought both pride and pain. Quebec voted twice on whether to separate, in 1980 and 1995, but chose to stay. Canada became known for peace, healthcare, and education, but Indigenous peoples continued to fight for justice. Residential school survivors began to speak out. Stories of abuse and loss shocked the nation. The Truth and Reconciliation movement began, a promise to remember, to learn, and to repair. Economically, Canada joined the global market with NAFTA. Culturally, it became a hub for art, film, and music. Cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver grew into international centers. Today, Canada stands as one of the world's most diverse countries. Over 200 languages are spoken. It's home to people from every continent. Yet, challenges remain: climate change, reconciliation, inequality, and identity. Canadians still ask, what does it mean to be Canadian? Is it kindness, tolerance, freedom, or the courage to face hard truths about the past? Canada's history isn't perfect, but it's a story of survival, hope, and renewal. A country born from conflict, grown through cooperation, and still searching for unity. As the maple leaf waves above its vast land, it reminds every citizen. This nation was built not in a moment, but over centuries, and its story is still being written.